Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive on something I think we can all relate to. Sex education. We're going to be going way back in time, exploring its history, and we're drawing on this really interesting book by Jonathan Zimmerman called Too Hot to Handle, A Global History of Sex Education. And I think we're going to find some pretty surprising stuff along the way.
Yeah, what really surprised me was it's kind of this common idea that, the U.S. is kind of behind Europe when it comes to being, open about sex. But actually, the U.S. was like a pioneer in sex education early in the 20th century.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I just always assumed Europe would have been ahead of the game in that area. Why do you think that is about the U.S.?
Well, I think it has to do with America having this really strong system of public education early on. And there was this kind of belief that education could be used to solve social problems. So sex ed was seen as a way to combat venereal disease, which was a huge concern back then.
Oh, wow. I see. So it was much more focused on the risks of sex.
Exactly. It was very much a public health approach, emphasizing the dangers and the science of reproduction.
So no birds and the bees, just don't do it, basically.
Pretty much. And the American Social Hygiene Association, or ISHA, they were really the driving force behind this movement. And what's interesting is that they didn't just focus on the U.S. They actually shared their materials and expertise globally. They even sent films to places like Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro.
Wow, it sounds like they were really trying to spread their message all over the place.
They were, and it shows. Even back then, they saw this as a global issue.
So did other countries have similar approaches to the U.S. during this time?
Not necessarily. For example, in France, there was a lot of pushback from the Catholic Church. They saw sex education as interfering with the family and morality.
Right, because of their views on premarital sex and things like that.
Exactly. And, Zimmerman talks about this incident with the Swedish ambassador complaining to Time magazine about an article that portrayed Sweden as being sexually permissive. It caused a big controversy, and it shows how different cultural perceptions around sex ed can be.
So even within Europe, there are these really different comfort levels with talking about sex. What about outside of Europe in the U.S.? What was happening in other parts of the world?
Oh, that's where things get even more interesting. So think about the Soviet Union after the revolution. There was actually this brief period of almost radical sexual liberation.
Really?
Yeah, they had this glass of water theory, which basically said that sex was a simple need, just like drinking water.
Wow, that's a pretty bold idea for that time. Did that last long?
It was short-lived, actually. Even Lenin became concerned that this sexual freedom would distract from the revolution. So the Soviet Union ended up shifting to a more conservative approach, emphasizing morality and responsible behavior.
So even in a place that started out embracing sexual freedom, they ended up going back to more traditional values.
It's a pattern we see a lot, actually, this kind of back and forth, between periods of openness and then a swing back to more conservative values.
That makes sense. I guess it's such a complex issue, and it's so tied up with social and political anxieties. So I'm guessing things changed quite a bit as we moved into the post-World War II era.
Oh, absolutely. After World War II, the focus of sex ed shifted in a lot of countries, including the U.S. It moved towards this idea of family life education.
What does that mean exactly?
So it emphasized healthy relationships, marriage, and responsible parenthood. And Asia was a big part of this shift. They were promoting the idea that a strong family equals a strong America. And ultimately, they saw it as contributing to world peace.
That's interesting. They were really connecting the personal with the global.
Exactly. And Asia even helped to set up sex ed organizations in occupied countries like Germany and Japan.
Wow. So they were really trying to spread this American ideal of family life.
Yeah, you could definitely say that.
It makes you wonder how other countries felt about that. Were they all on board with this American model?
Well, there were definitely some tensions. For example, while Asia was promoting family life ed, they initially resisted including family planning and birth control in the curriculum.
Interesting. So it wasn't just about teaching kids about healthy relationships. It was also about controlling population growth or maybe promoting certain values.
It raises these questions about, what's the real purpose of sex education? Is it just about individual health and morality? Or is it about shaping society in a certain way?
This is already giving me a whole new perspective on sex ed. It's not just about the biology. It's about values, culture, and even global politics.
Exactly. And things get even more fascinating as we move into the era of the sexual revolution.
So we're talking about how the U.S. was promoting family-focused sex ed as this counter to communism. Did that Cold War rivalry affect how other countries approached sex ed?
It definitely played a role. And remember ASHA, the American organization we talked about. They were working in countries that were seen as vulnerable to communist influence. It was very much about promoting American values and trying to counter that influence.
It makes you wonder how much of an impact those efforts actually had. Did they really succeed in shaping how people around the world thought about sex and family?
It's hard to say for sure. Alche definitely had a lot of influence, especially after World War II. But each country has its own unique culture and history that shaped how sex ed was received. It wasn't a simple case of just imposing one model on everybody.
And then, of course, you had the sexual revolution. How did that change the landscape of sex education?
It was a huge turning point, no doubt about it. The sexual revolution was all about personal freedom and challenging traditional norms. And it led to some really heated debates all over the world. Young people in particular started demanding more open and honest conversations about sex. They were pushing back against the old ways of teaching it, which were often very clinical and focused on fear.
It's interesting to think about how educators reacted to those demands. Were they ready to handle that kind of shift?
Well, it was definitely a time of adjustment. There were student protests demanding changes to the curriculum. Some students even called for love rooms in schools.
Love rooms? What were those?
They were spaces where students could, put what they were learning into practice.
Wow, that's a pretty radical demand.
It shows you how much young people were questioning the status quo.
So did things actually change in classrooms? Were schools becoming more open about discussing sex?
Well, there was definitely a movement towards more openness, but the reality in a lot of classrooms was still pretty different. A lot of schools kept focusing on the biology and advocating for abstinence. They avoided talking about things like pleasure or relationships.
So there was this disconnect between what students wanted and what was actually being taught. That must have been frustrating for young people who were looking for more guidance.
Oh, definitely. And while all this was happening, there was also a conservative backlash brewing. Figures like Mary Whitehouse in the UK and groups like the National Viewers and Listeners Association, they were really leading the charge against what they saw as the permissiveness of sex ed.
I'm not familiar with Mary Whitehouse. Could you tell us a little bit more about her?
She was a British activist who became really well known for speaking out against what she saw as the decline of morality in the media and society. She was especially critical of sex education. She saw it as a threat to traditional values. She campaigned for censorship and a more conservative approach to sex ed.
So the debate was getting really intense.
Absolutely, and it wasn't just happening in one country. Conservative groups all over the world started connecting with each other. They shared tactics, and they framed their efforts as a global struggle against moral decline.
So it's kind of like a global culture war with sex education as one of the battlegrounds.
Exactly. It shows how sex education is always tied up with these larger social and political anxieties. It's never just about the facts themselves.
And Zimmerman actually mentions a funny example of how heated this debate became.
Yeah.
The band Pink Floyd even mocked Mary Whitehouse in one of their songs.
That's right. The song Pigs, 3 different ones from their Animals album. It's a direct criticism of Whitehouse and her censorship efforts.
It's amazing to think about how even rock stars were weighing in on this issue. So we have young people demanding more openness, a conservative backlash trying to restrict things, and the whole debate getting tangled up with global politics. It sounds like the stage was set for a major turning point.
And a major turning point did arrive in the 1980s with the emergence of the HIV/AIDS crisis.
That must have completely changed the conversation around sex education.
Oh, it absolutely did. It became a matter of life and death, and it forced a lot of countries to rethink their whole approach to sex ed.
It makes sense that the AIDS crisis would push safe sex practices to the forefront.
Exactly. It became a major public health priority, and a lot of countries had to implement or expand their sex education programs. The urgency of the situation forced some countries to adopt much more explicit approaches.
So even countries that might have been resistant to discussing these topics before, they had to adapt to this new reality.
It was a real wake-up call for a lot of people.
Did different countries approach this challenge in similar ways? Or were there still variations in how they taught sex education?
Well, the AIDS crisis definitely created a sense of urgency everywhere, but approaches still varied a lot. Zimmerman talks about the Netherlands as an example. They took a really direct and explicit approach to HIV/AIDS education. They even used anatomical models for condom demonstrations.
Wow, that's a pretty bold approach.
It was, but it shows how seriously they were taking the threat. The AIDS crisis forced people to prioritize saving lives over maintaining traditional taboos.
Did the AIDS crisis help to silence the opposition to sex education?
Unfortunately, not entirely. Even with a global health crisis going on, there were still people who were opposed to sex education. Especially in the developing world, there were concerns about cultural values and adolescent autonomy. Some people saw it as a form of Western cultural imperialism.
It's interesting how those global trends interact with local contexts.
Yeah, Zimmerman talks about Ghana as an example. He says that sex education textbooks there often use biblical passages to condemn premarital sex, and they even gave advice on how to resist the temptations of internet pornography.
Wow, so it was this mix of traditional values and anxieties about new technology.
Exactly, and all of that was playing into the global debate about sex education.
It seems like the challenges facing sex education just kept getting more complex.
They did, as the world became more globalized and interconnected. So did the debates around sex education. It's not just a national issue anymore, it's a global conversation.
This has been such an eye-opening journey. We've seen how sex education went from a public health concern to this battleground for social and political ideologies.
It really makes you appreciate how complex this issue is and how it reflects all these larger trends happening in the world.
I'm curious to hear what you think are the most important things we've learned so far.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that sex education is never just about the facts. It's always a reflection of deeper social anxieties, cultural norms, and political agendas. And I think it's crucial to understand those complexities if we want to have productive conversations about sex education.
We've been talking about how sex ed got all tangled up with politics and cultural values and stuff. But then you had this whole new wave of globalization and the rise of the internet around the turn of the century. What kind of impact did that have on this debate?
Well, the internet especially just threw a whole new wrench in the works. On the one hand, it gave people way more access to information about sex and relationships than ever before. Young people could learn about things that were totally taboo in their own communities.
So the internet could actually empower young people in a way.
Exactly. But then there's the flip side. The internet also opened the door to tons of misinformation and even harmful content.
It's that classic double-edged sword of technology.
Right. And for sex ed, it meant trying to figure out how to use this powerful tool while also protecting young people from the risks.
I bet those who were already opposed to sex ed saw the internet as a huge threat.
Oh, definitely. They saw it as this wild west of immorality, spreading all these dangerous ideas and undermining traditional values.
And with globalization, these concerns weren't just limited to one country anymore. Did you see the rise of international movements pushing back against this?
You definitely did. One example is the World Congress of Families. It's a global alliance of conservative organizations that popped up in the late 20th century. They saw themselves as fighting back against the sexual revolution and trying to promote these traditional family values worldwide.
So it became like a global culture war.
Exactly. And then you had the U.S. government under George W. Bush pushing abstinence-only programs both in the U.S. and abroad.
Right. So politics definitely played a role. This has been such a fascinating look at the history of sex ed. We've seen how it evolved from a public health issue to this battleground of values and ideologies.
It really shows how complex this issue is and how it reflects all these broader changes happening in the world.
What are some of the biggest takeaways for you?
I think the key thing to remember is that sex education is never just about the facts. It's always intertwined with social anxieties, cultural norms, and political agendas. And we need to understand that complexity if we want to have any hope of moving forward.
So where do we go from here? How do we make sure young people are getting accurate and helpful information about sex?
That's the million-dollar question. There's no easy answer. But I think it starts with open and honest conversations. We need to be willing to listen to different perspectives and recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
It sounds like we still have a long way to go.
We do, but the journey is definitely worth it.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the history of sex education. We hope you found it insightful, maybe even a little bit challenging. If you want to learn more, we encourage you to check out Jonathan Zimmerman's book and keep exploring this fascinating and ever-evolving topic. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep the conversation going.